And next up, we're going to just move right into our next sister who's going to present. And before I introduce who she is, I want to say it's interesting because this workshop actually started more as an idea for, I was thinking about our brown and Black sisters and processing what's going on and what do you do with the fears and the anger and like, what do we do? And so we wanted to try to create a space for our sisters of color to be able to process some of this. And so I talked to the diversity team and they said, you know, actually, Megan, I think it would be helpful for everybody to hear this, not just the sisters of color, because there's different needs that we have within that. So so we decided, let's do that. And then we'll address, let's just take 2020, let's take it all on today anyway, since we're doing it. But Anastacia Sams is the sister that is going to talk to us about this. And, you know, it was helpful because a conversation with her after George Floyd was killed helped me kind of think through the need for some of these things, to talk about some of these things and what it looks like. So you can, if you don't like this workshop, blame Anna, because the idea kind of started from a conversation with her. But Anastacia is, she is a counselor, of a couples and family therapist. She's been a Christian for 13 years, and 7 of those years she's been a member here in the Denver church. She's a thoughtful, compelling, her spirit is so gentle, but there's like some fire in there. So it's like the how do they call it, a velvet wrapped sword? She's like a velvet wrapped sword. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Anna, and we look forward to hearing what you have to teach us.
Thank you, Megan. Let's see. Great, so I'm Anastacia. I'm a couples and family therapist here in Colorado. And so I have the privilege of speaking with you about how to cope with racial injustice. I will be focusing most of my attention on how to help Black women navigate the daily impact of racism. And so my hope is that if you are a Black woman who is joining us today, that you'll leave feeling seen, as well as feeling that you have some tools and resources you can use to manage the burden of racism in this country. And for those of you who are joining today and you're not a Black woman, my hope is that you'll understand the reality of the history of racial injustice in this country, and that and how it continues to affect your Black sisters. And so I hope that you will leave our time today choosing not only to see their pain, but to also become proactive participants in their healing. Great, so I would like to start a bit, I drew on my screen too, so. Susan, you're not alone. And so in order to understand the trauma that Black women continuously experience, I think that we do first have to go back and just take a brief look at some of the gruesome history that has contributed to that trauma. And so I would like to start with talking about American chattel slavery. And so Dr. Joy DeGruy, in her book, which is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, describes the experience of a slave as being whipped until skin peeled off, worked to exhaustion day after day, beaten, deprived of food and water, raped repeatedly, considered less than livestock and treated worse. And that was the life of a slave. And that's not to mention how slavery terrorized the soul, undermined people's humanity, and robbed them of their dignity. White slave masters also had a tendency to exercise their sexual privileges on young girls. Many had barely reached their early teen years without being sexually assaulted by their slave masters. And this includes Reverend John Newton, who admitted to raping countless women on slave ships during his involvement in transporting African people into a life fraught with torment and bondage. And many of you know him as the man who wrote Amazing Grace. Dr. James Marion Sims, the founder of modern gynecology, in addition to raping enslaved Black women, also built a makeshift hospital in his backyard where he conducted surgical experiments on countless women without anesthesia. And he reasoned that these women were able to bear great pain because their race made them more durable, and thus they were well suited for painful medical experimentation. Lynching is another part of our history that, started pre-slavery, but also continued on after. And so PBS describes lynching as an act of terror meant to spread fear among Blacks, which served the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in the economic, social, and political spheres. There's an example of this that L.J. Bennett recounts in his book in 1918, where a pregnant Black woman, Mary Turner, was, quote, hanged, covered with oil and gasoline, and burned. As she dangled from the rope, a man stepped forward with a pocket knife, ripped open her abdomen in a crude cesarean operation, and out tumbled the prematurely born child. 2 feeble cries it gave, and received for answer the heel of a stalwart man as life was ground out of its tiny form. And so police brutality has been considered a form of modern day lynching. And with this, there are countless examples, so I've only included 2. One of them was the murder of Tatiana Jefferson. She was a 28-year-old who was shot in her own home in the middle of the night while watching her 8-year-old nephew. Her neighbor saw that her car was home, everyone's cars were home, but one of the doors was left open. And so her neighbor called 311 just wanting to make sure that Tatiana was okay. And what happened was, not only did the police who came not identify himself, but he instead circled her home, yelled for her to put her hands up, and then almost immediately shot and killed her. And this was at 2:25 in the morning. And as many of you know, Breonna Taylor was also asleep in her home when she was murdered by the police, and her killers continue to remain free. And so Dr. Joy DeGruy states that the unrelenting violence and harassment that Black Americans experience, both personally and vicariously through the media, serves to dampen much of the hope and anticipation that we will ever be full and equal participants in this land. And so imagine seeing people who look like you be brutally murdered over and over again, while living in a country that has built racism into the very fabric of its being. A country that refuses to acknowledge, heal, and restore the people whom they stripped of their humanity. Instead, you're still stripped of humanity and dignity 400 years later. Imagine living in a constant state of fear and anxiety that is built into your DNA because of the unrelenting trauma you experience from simply existing. Imagine that every time you see someone who looks like you be stripped of their humanity and of their life because of the color of their skin, you see your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, your husband, your child, or yourself, and you fear that you or a loved one could be next. This is the reality that Black women live in. And so this type of sustained trauma that keeps happening over and over again can create quite a few symptoms. And some of these examples of the sustained trauma are microaggressions, which are everyday, subtle, sometimes unintentional interactions that communicate a negative bias towards marginalized groups. And so an example of this could be commenting on a Black woman's strength rather than seeing her pain when she shares something vulnerable. Racial terrorism, just, from police brutality to just so many other acts of terror that are simply because of being Black. Re-traumatization from reliving injustices that you or a loved one have experienced. And again, having to see people who look like you be hunted and killed just for existing. Black moms who are raising their children in a society that not only hates their children, but kills them without thinking twice. Having to endure these layers of oppression without people acknowledging your pain as you bear the burden of navigating all of that pain alone in a world where you feel invisible. Being seen or seeing yourself as a strong Black woman, which perpetuates the destructive belief that as a Black woman, you're not worthy of being seen or deserving of the space to heal. And then the CDC conducted a study where they came up with a new word called weathering. And weathering describes the way the constant stress of racism can lead to premature biological aging and worse health outcomes for Black people. It often shows up emotionally, physically, and behaviorally. And I don't have time to include many of the everyday consequences of racism, such as the difficulty that Black people have purchasing a house because their white neighbors don't want Black bodies inhabiting their space, being rejected for a job because of your natural hair. So many examples. And the voices of Black women are constantly dismissed and silenced. And so that, coupled with the exhaustion of recurrent trauma, often results in symptoms of depression, grief and loss, and anxiety. And so I would like to show you a short video that briefly describes how this trauma and just the history of trauma continues to affect Black women today. And I don't think I can remove the drawing, so I'll just, we'll run with it.
From the beginning, everything was set up for us not to survive.
We were meant to survive as units of labor. We were meant to survive as commodities. Society's views toward Black women are framed through these particular images.
She's aggressive, violent,
Out of control. That's all you are.
it flies in the face of the reality of who we are.
For decades, all we wanted was to be accepted and visible instead of invisible.
The only way that can happen is if we ensure that it happens by creating our own narrative and knowing our own stories.
You have to be able to give words to it, give names to it.
If you don't tell your own story, somebody else will.
By telling our own stories, there's a kind of fierce independence of mind, of will, tenacity.
No matter what stands in our way, no matter how hard it gets,
Still we rise.
I will stay strong. I'm never giving up faith. I will go all the way. This will be the day.
There's nothing more beautiful.
Brave, unbossed,
Loving, independent,
Strong.
divine. I think that Black women are divine.
So I've broken up the symptoms, the grief and loss, the anxiety, really the post-traumatic symptoms that Black women experience into emotional and physical symptoms. And this is just like it doesn't include everything, but as a start, emotional, there's persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, worthlessness, suicidal thoughts or intention, irritability, fear and anxiety, recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive memories, traumatic nightmares, intense or prolonged distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, avoidance of distressing stimuli, feeling alienated or isolated from others, a lack of interest in things that you used to enjoy, or an inability to experience positive emotions. Some of the physical symptoms that can present are persistent exhaustion, a change in sleep or appetite, body aches, nausea, headaches, and difficulty focusing or remembering events, which is also known as dissociative amnesia. So I have some coping strategies for Black women. I think first and foremost, it is important to give yourself the space and permission to feel your most vulnerable emotions. I think emotions can be secondary or primary. I think secondary is more of the frustration or feeling upset. The primary emotions are the ones that are more difficult to sit with and deal with. And so those are the fear, the hurt, the sadness, loneliness, disappointment. It is so important to give yourself the space to feel those. And I think to find a space with others as well, where you feel safe, where you feel safe enough to show up. And so I think to determine who your safe people are, or your safe spaces, think of the places where you feel safe enough to show up as your full self. And those are the best places for you to really process these things. Journaling is so helpful. I think, lamenting, praying, mourning, it's a great way to outwardly express your inner experiences in a way that can produce healing. Meditation, it really slows down your thoughts. It allows you to identify your feelings, and it creates a space for the Spirit, not just to speak to you, but also for him to comfort you. Shabbat, which is one of my personal favorites, taking a Sabbath day of rest, creating space for intentional rest with Adonai creates that space for healing. And I think, it's important to remember that nothing is too small to contribute to your healing. And so incorporating these things in small ways is helpful. So for our sisters who are wanting to support, I have BIPOC up here. It's an acronym that stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color. And so for sisters wanting to support their BIPOC sisters, I think first and foremost is so important to initiate the conversation, and to do it understanding that not all Black women are able to publicly bear their pain. And so they may not be ready to speak, but initiating that conversation shows how much you care. I think listening to understand, knowing that every person's experience is different. James gives us a great way, just a great guideline for how to listen actively. Understand this, my beloved brothers and sisters. Let everyone be quick to hear, be a careful and thoughtful listener, slow to speak, a speaker of carefully chosen words, and slow to anger, patient, reflective, and forgiving. Allow yourself to sit in their pain while giving them permission to freely express all of the hurt that injustice invokes. And so when I think of an example of this, I think about an example with my college roommates. I remember something had happened. It was something traumatic. I had found out bad news about my youngest brother, and I was numb. I could not, for those of you who know me, it's already hard for me to express my emotions. So you can imagine what it was like. And so my roommates at the time sat on both sides of me and just listened. And they both just started crying. And when they were crying, it felt like they were crying the tears that I couldn't cry. And so I think that is such a great example of sitting in people's pain. I think Jesus gives us a great example with Lazarus. And when he comes back and Mary is understandably upset, Jesus doesn't, he doesn't rebuke her for approaching him with her hurt. He doesn't justify the fact that, hey, I'm about to perform this miracle, so you'll be fine, it'll be okay. Instead, he feels this deep-seated compassion that moves him so much that he weeps with her, knowing full and well that he's about to raise him from the dead. And being kind, compassionate, and nurturing as you listen without questioning their pain. And so avoiding cliche Christian responses of God will never give you more than you can handle. Have you prayed about it? This world is not our home. I think it's so important to petition in prayer for our collective healing, because this affects all of us. And so I think prayer is huge, as well as educating yourself. And so in Ghana, there is a word, Sankofa, and it translates to go back to the past and bring forth that which is useful. It talks about being able to acknowledge and accept the past, learn from it, and learn how to move forward. And so I think that that is incredibly important, especially just with our gruesome history as a country, being able to look at the past, to acknowledge it, to see how it affects us so that we can find ways where we can truly move forward together. And so understanding American history, the history of the American church, and how the two have contributed and can continue to contribute to the oppression of BIPOC people. And last but not least, I have to be a part of the change. And so something that I've been meditating on in this time is time itself. Just, you know, I think it's one of God's greatest gifts to us. And I think as we've talked about, we're continuously realizing how limited our time is. And so what better way to use the time that God has given us in this season than to fulfill part of his greatest commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so I have James again. Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. And so as I come to a close, my hope is that my Black sisters feel validated and seen, and my non-Black sisters feel encouraged to be proactive in our collective healing. So, thank you.
Amen. Anna, thank you so much. Thank you for giving context, giving background, for talking about something that's hard. I know that there's not at any point in your discussion did anybody feel comfortable. You know, I think we all feel uncomfortable. We all feel, yeah, you being willing to speak vulnerably about what you're seeing and what you're feeling and where do you think we need to go? I think I'm just super grateful for this discussion. I think these are discussions that we have to have and to continue to have and to wrestle through. And I think for all of us, I hope this is something that sparks conversation. You know, I know sometimes, again, when we're not comfortable with discussing things like this, we want to draw our lines in the sand and retreat to our corners. I hope that this today would be something that helps us actually walk closer to one another. We don't have to agree always with what one another sees or says or feels, but we have to be willing to want to listen and understand and see. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to be a part of growing together and doing this together. So super, super grateful, Anna, for putting yourself out there and for providing your expertise in the area. So it feels really bad pivoting. I'm like, ooh, I just feel like we need to go pray. Everybody go pray but